to have this conversation with you. Thank you for taking time out of your very full schedule to record this interview with me.
Pleasure.
So, as a practicing ER physician, leader, entrepreneur, you continue to pioneer impactful changes to the healthcare delivery model. Did you initially set out to create these businesses to improve efficiency, increase access, and reduce medical costs?
No, I just, looking back at the time, saw a need and thought way back in the urgent care days, someone and sometimes going to say, why are we spending so much money for patients with, basically relatively trivial complaints? And there must be another way to do it. Urgent cares hadn't really started yet. And I think there's probably a few in the country, but they're pretty few and far between. And so living in Phoenix, there weren't any. So I started one in Phoenix and grew it from there.
So, MeMD, you started in 2010, 10 years ago, and it provides telehealth and telebehavioral health services.
Correct.
So, after building NextCare, what did you see that healthcare still needed that inspired your vision for this company and to take healthcare services online?
Well, a couple of things. One, with urgent care centers, providers often had downtime. So in the winter they were busy. In Arizona in the summer they were slow. And even when they were slow, you still had the overhead of the urgent care center to pay for, including provider salaries. And so about 2009, I thought, well, if there was a way to leverage their medical license or licenses, if they had more than one state, and they could see patients virtually, wouldn't that be a great way to improve the revenue model, which would help mitigate some of the fixed expenses? And then number two is a lot of patients, friends would call up and they'd tell me their symptoms, and I would say, oh, it sounds like you need X. And then if it was appropriate, I'd call in an antibiotic for them, jot a quick note down. But wow, this could be a business model, seeing patients virtually, because a lot of patients, the majority of the diagnosis is in the history and little's in the physical. But for those patients, wouldn't it be great if they could see a provider online, much like you and I are talking now, and you could, electronically document their medical record, they could upload any information, and you could e-prescribe. And so that was a genesis of MeMD in 2010.
Well, I've interviewed some healthcare companies and providers that telehealth was, in their business plans, and they just started to use it during this pandemic. And did MeMD have to develop any new capabilities to address COVID-19?
No, we were, I always say, always somebody became the hot girl to dance in 2010. For 9 years, it was convincing people the importance of it. And this year, we had to do very little convincing.
So how does the virtual healthcare model and the brick and mortar healthcare model support each other?
Well, I think when I left NextCare and started MeMD, I went around to urgent cares and pitched them on the idea of, wouldn't it be great during your provider's downtime that they could see patients from all over the state? And if they had more than one license, all over multiple states. At the time, I think I had 30 licenses. And almost to a person, to a urgent care center, except one, they said, well, yeah, but we're going to steal our own business. In other words, for the patients that normally come to us, they'll just come virtually now, where the charges are half. And why would we want to do it to ourselves? And I said, yeah, I think some people will do that, but you'll have, your urgent care sees people in about a 3 to 4 mile radius statistically. So wouldn't you want to have access to the whole state? And that way also you can get your name out there to the folks in other parts of the state. And literally, I could not get anybody to buy off on that concept, probably because I was a bad salesperson. But now most urgent cares have a telemedicine component to what they're doing. But back then, and for multiple years after, I couldn't get anybody to buy into that.
That's interesting. So going back to your ER days, what were the problems you were seeing there that, inspired you to create NextCare to solve those issues?
Well, I'm sitting in the emergency department right now, and it's a brand new freestanding, so it's not super busy. Of course, when you called, it was. And probably half the patients I've seen today don't need to be in the emergency department. And when I went into emergency medicine, what I liked about it was taking care of critical patients. I liked doing the procedures. I liked really sick patients. And I saw over the years more and more patients were utilizing it as their primary care physician for a number of reasons. One, the lack of primary care physicians and lack of access. And number two, when those patients came in, they shared a disproportionate amount of the costs. So people would come in with a UTI or bronchitis or something simple would often walk out with a $600 to $900 bill between the hospital and facility bill and the professional component, the physician bill, and then the radiology and lab and every other thing. You know, they were literally getting crushed with the cost of it. And so for an urgent care model, you know, our goal is to keep the net revenue per patient around $120. And so oftentimes patients were paying 20%, 18% of what they'd spend in the emergency department. And it was much quicker oftentimes as well because we were, you know, at least in NextCare, we were hyper efficient.
And so with regard to the urgent care, and how did you see them when you were starting NextCare? Did you talk to, you know, your expertise is in emergency medicine, but did you talk to primary care and family care and internal medicine and try to see where you could make the urgent cares work where they couldn't? I mean, sometimes now when you call a primary care physician and you need to see someone immediately, you know, you're scheduled still a few days out. So how are you able to mold the urgent care to get right into that sliver between, you know, the community medicine where you need to make an appointment that's a couple days out and then not have to go into the emergency room, which should be for critical care?
So when I started, I talked to everybody. First off, none of the health plans had any sort of urgent care benefits for the patients, nor did they have an urgent care payment structure for urgent care since there weren't any. So that was the initial big leap, getting the health plans to buy into it. So next it was going on the primary care offices and saying, look, we're not competing with you. Just after hours, on weekends, on holidays, we're here. We'll refer your patients back to you after the visit. So we're not trying to steal patients. We went to great pains making sure the primary care folks knew we weren't trying to co-opt their patients for our own. And then we went to emergency departments too and said to them, if you have patients that you're seeing who have no primary care to follow up with, and follow-up's a big deal in the emergency department, feel free to send them to us. And we're happy to act as that stop between the emergency department and finding the primary care doctor for follow-up. So we kind of pitched it to pretty much every segment of healthcare.
And were they receptive?
It took a while. It took a while for the patients as well. I mean, the patient education, this took a few years because patients, you know, we were in Denver opening up and a patient said to me, so I have to be sicker to come to an urgent care than I do into an emergency department. And I thought to myself, I'm screwed. Because to me, this was just a no-brainer concept of why this fits in the healthcare space and how it fits in. And I found myself continually having to educate people on the place for urgent cares, which today seems totally ridiculous.
Right.
But 27 years ago, it's just the way it was. It just wasn't a concept out there in most places in the country.
When you started NextCare, did you ever plan it to grow to 58 clinics in 6 states?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly planned for it to grow, but as it grew, I realized that once you have the model down, and I'd always tell, you know, the first 3 are tough, and then there's the next big leap of faith is 10. Once you have 10, now it starts going to be a pretty scaling business. And then once we're up to 25, again, it was another kind of whole leap of faith as far as the support you needed for it. But once you got to that point, it became, I don't want to say cookie cutter, but we knew what we were doing. We knew the cash flow, we knew the model, we knew how to pick out spots. And I'm not saying it was perfect, nor did we not make mistakes. I made them all. But it got to be a lot easier.
And how did you consider a new location for a clinic?
So, you know, it was much like fast food, and you hate to call it that way, but it was ingress and egress. We like to be on corners, like to be at a stoplight, bi-directional traffic, with an anchor tenant in the plaza. We did not like to be in line in a strip mall. We did not like to be in a medical office building unless it had unless it was on the first floor, again, with great visibility, good ingress and egress, large signage, and a stoplight. So we got to be pretty selective, but a lot of places we looked at were fast food restaurant-esque sort of paths.
It sounds like you really thought of the problem from the view of the patient.
Yes, absolutely. It was a very patient-centric model, and it had to be.
Right. And these centers, did you own them? Did you lease them out? Do build a
No,
suit?
we leased them all. First, I didn't have the capital to own them, which was our biggest rate limiting factor. And the capital we had, we felt better to be deployed in growing the centers, as opposed to the McDonald's model where they own their space, where they own the property, and part of their value is in that property.
Absolutely. So I'm sure you're constantly thinking about the future of healthcare and where you see some more innovation. So where do you see healthcare evolving immediately post-COVID and then further in the future regarding, improving speed, affordability, quality, and delivery?
I mean, certainly telemedicine is here to stay. Again, I mean, it took 9 years. Probably the last 3 years, we, became a, what the hell is it, to a, oh yeah, I've heard of it, to a, oh, that's kind of cool, to a, wow, that's something we should have, to now it's a must have. And I see that continuing. So, me and Dee is in a fortunate spot that we have I have 10 years of gray hair uh, on my belt, to take me and Dee to the next level. But where I think healthcare is going, and it should go, is we need a much better behavioral health model that's out there right now. There's a lot of people struggling with behavioral health issues. They can't find caregivers, both on the medical side and on the behavioral health side. And that care has to be integrated. So the behavioral health people have to be talking to the medical people, because so much of the issues have an integration problem associated with it. So that needs to be improved upon. I think that's going to be a big next blue ocean sort of opportunity. The next is AI. So I'm a big AI fan, and using AI to help streamline patient care and to improve diagnosis. Certainly that's going to be the next iteration. So we've started to go down that path, using AI to help segregate and segment patients by severity, by disease type, and by treatment.
Well, that's interesting because then you could just create the critical pipeline and treat, patients accordingly.
And that's what, way back with NextCare days, we kind of built, and I can't say it was AI, but it was very care path directed patient algorithms based upon patient complaint and exam findings. So if a patient came in and on their chief complaint, they wrote, we'll do an easy one, shortness of breath, then they were triaged in post triage, and automatically tests were ordered, things were done, so that by the time the provider saw them, the patient would have the appropriate labs, EKG, chest x-ray, lung residual volumes, and other things. The provider could say, wow, it looks like you came in with this, here's your exam findings, all these tests have already been done, and here's your diagnosis, or here's what our plan is. So I called it, I wanted to take medicine away from sequential treatment to concurrent treatment. So the patients weren't going to the waiting room, then to the front desk, then back to the waiting room, then the triage, back to the waiting room. I wanted it to all happen at once. So they were being triaged while they're going through the front desk process, that we take their cards, take their insurance cards. And at that time, tests were ordered and tests were initiated while they're waiting for the provider to see them. So we cut down our door-to-door time dramatically just by looking at it, again, from the patient's perspective, thinking about concurrent care, not sequential care. I hate having to wait in line for things when things could be done coterminously and not sequentially.
Well, and sometimes it's nice as the patient not to have to handle your medical information from physician to physician, because sometimes, the terms and all of that stuff, it's, you're just not familiar with them. It's not in your vernacular. And it would be nice to be able to streamline that from provider to provider. I think as a benefit from a patient perspective is one, from the patient side, obviously from the provider side, then also you're not relying on the patient having to remember their diagnosis or, go through their symptoms again. You can probably make it more efficient.
Right. And I think the next big iteration for healthcare will be the use of blockchain for medical records. And so patients will allow access to their blockchain medical records to their provider, to the hospital system, that all the records will be basically updated immediately into the blockchain, which a patient will own, and patient will be able to dole out access depending on where they are. I think that'll really be it'll be cost saving, because there's so many times when someone says, oh yeah, I had an MRI yesterday. And they told me to come in. Well, what did it show? I don't know. They told me to come in. So you call up and they say, hey, what did their MRI show? Sorry, we're closed. And so it happens so much, it's laughable. And Arizona's not bad with our community kind of health information system, but we're a little bit of a rarity. And there's still times when they have an MRI at a place that's closed, someone calls the patient, says, you better get to the ED. Okay, they're on their way. No idea. And so you end up repeating the MRI, which is a waste of time and money, but there's no other option.
Well, I would even say, taking it a step further, once you obviously are, as a provider, you treat the critical need of the patient, having a more integrated, streamlined care system takes you to the next step of being able to recommend more wellness treatments that they can do post, recovering from this critical care that they needed, but to try to prevent them from having to come back for critical care treatment.
Right, and we do a lot of things we do a lot of unnecessary things or duplicative things because of this lack of information. The other thing is there is a large what's a good word? I mean, patients often don't understand their own body, so there's a large amount of health illiteracy out there. And so just the time spent educating patients, telling them they're really okay, is exorbitant. And a lot of money is spent proving to patients that they are in fact okay. And I don't know how we'll fix health illiteracy, but it's rampant out there.
Absolutely. And do you feel, so on that note though, do you feel that there, now that people are on high deductible insurance or other plans, do you see some a tranche of people being illiterate, but then some being really well educated and directing their health, or do you see it as a chasm, or where do you see
I
it?
think with high deductible plans, the buyer becomes much more sensitive to healthcare spending, particularly for themselves, not necessarily for their kids or their dogs and cats. They seem to spend limitlessly for that, but for themselves, which I think is a good thing. Because I think an educated consumer is a healthier consumer, a better prepared consumer. But if you look at the people we see in the emergency department, if you took away smoking, excessive alcohol, drugs, and obesity, probably 70% of our business would be gone. You add to that use of helmets and seatbelts, another 5% easily. So there's a lot of things that we see that are super preventative. And when you point it out to patients, say, it's probably that 40 years of smoking that I now have to put a on the back or put you on a ventilator for. They often have an aha moment look on them, and I'm always going to laugh like, wait, like this is the first time you've heard this? Because 20 years ago at least someone said he ought to stop smoking. But I get it. I mean, people, everybody has challenges, but a lot of the health challenge we have in the U.S. are of our own doing. Not all of them, but
Right.
Certainly the majority of them are.
That's interesting. Well, John, so I'm going to move to the part of the interview where we get to know you a little bit, kind of what inspires you as a leader. So what was your first job?
Mowing lawns, shoveling snow.
That's a
Probably
common
when I
one.
was super young. I went around house to house and peddled my services, summers and winters, and then I was selling racing forms and scratch sheets by Arlington Park Racetrack. And I literally when I was really young, I made candles and chocolate and hard candies and sold them. So I've literally been entrepreneurial as long as I can remember.
Well, I had to change this next question for you because you've done a ton, but what else would you want to be doing for a living that you haven't already accomplished?
Professional chef.
Interesting.
Yeah, I love to cook. Or possibly, my son's an Air Force pilot. He's a fighter pilot. And I never considered that. And I've been flying for 30 years. I've never considered when I was at his age or before his age, I never considered flying for the Air Force. But it looks like a pretty cool gig.
Right.
Hearing what he does, seeing what he does, pretty damn cool.
Pretty
So
exciting.
chef, Air Force pilot.
In that order, or vice versa.
Old for the Air Force pilot, but I might still have a chance of being a chef.
So, who are you reading or listening to right now for news, information, or inspiration?
I read a ton of books. I try to read a book at least once a week. Read/listen to. I kind of mix them up. So it is. So there's a whole bunch of inspiration I get from reading. A lot of great mentors I've had. Dolores Kern's good one on leadership. Ryan Holiday, Obstacle is the Way. Um, his new book on stillness. Stillness is the key. One of his books called Ego's the Enemy. I've of course read Tribe of Mentors, in that series of two of them. So Tim Ferriss, and then I just read, unfortunately, probably Woodward's book, Rage, and then Gates's book, and then Bolton's book as well. Those are my last three. But then also Noel Uwe Harari on Sapiens and Homo Deus. Those were unbelievably great books. And Bill Bryson's A Brief History of Time was great. And then all of Malcolm Gladwell stuff.
Yeah. Sapiens is on my list. I haven't, it's in the queue.
It's
Uh,
it's great listening to that book. It's a dense book, but listening to it made it really easy. And then Ray Dalio's book, Principles, I thought was wonderful.
oh,
And John Doerr's book also on OKRs was great as well on the business side of things.
well, and
Uh,
you've authored some books on leadership as well of your own.
yeah, but none of them at the level of what I read. But so yeah, I've authored. I don't even know how many books. I'm working on two more now actually. But I try to author books on leadership, on self leadership, on entrepreneurism, and then I've had some medical textbooks as well.
Nice. So, what is one thing you do every day for healthy self care?
Um, I do a bunch. I run or bike every day, Peloton bike or run. I lift weights every day. I meditate every day. I hang upside down every day. And I just had a sauna completed, so I'll start using the sauna every day. My next is cold water immersion. So I'm getting my guts up for that one.
I'm at 2 minutes and 15 seconds for that, and it takes a long time to just yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I literally do the cold showers and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah.
I can completely get there, but physically, like I can jump in a cold lake, no problem. But literally getting in a cold tub with ice in it, I'm struggling.
It's the next mental plateau.
It is. It is. I'm a mind over matter person, so if I can't do this, my whole theory's failed.
Well, so you can answer one or both of these. So I end the interviews with when I interview real estate investors with our leaders born or trained, and then with providers, I end it with, do you think a person is born with the desire to heal, or is it learned only through their medical training? So you can answer one or both of those.
So I may have missed the first one was leaders. I'll
Yeah.
answer both. So I wanted to be a doctor when I was 5, as long as I can remember. And I always tell the story, which is probably not the most appropriate story, but I'll tell it anyway. When I was a little kid, I went to the doctor with my mom. I was probably 6, and it was just for a normal checkup with Dr. Giannini. And I'm sitting there minding my own business, and out of the blue, as if in a normal conversation, she said, "John touches himself too much down there." I remember opening my eyes like, holy crap. And Dr. Giannini looked at me and said, "Touch it again and I'll cut it off." So I haven't touched it since. But I literally remember, and it certainly wasn't that wanted me to be that I want to be a physician, but for as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a doctor. Maybe before I knew what a doctor actually did, I wanted to be a doctor. Since my earliest memories are looking into books about the heart and human bodies, and I read Denton Cooley's book on hearts and Michael DeBakey. And so I'd always wanted to be a physician, and that's what I was born to do. As far as leadership goes, that can certainly be, both can be learned traits. Empathy, caring can be learned, but I was fortunate, I think, that I was born with that. Leadership, I think, is a skill you have to constantly practice. So while I think I'm a moderately evolved leader, I also know multiple times every day where I have a long way to go, where I say, well, I could have done that one better. And so and one of the reasons I read a ton is because I look for leadership lessons from the greats, Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Ray Dalio. I mean, people who are really aspiring and inspirational leaders. And I try to pick up their techniques and try to learn from them.
Well, those guys, they had should I say, they, in their role as leaders, they had to overcome and solve huge problems.
World changing events. Abraham Lincoln, I mean, certainly when you read his story, he was not a born leader, but he really evolved over time. Theodore Roosevelt may have been a born leader, but he was a kid who grew up with bad asthma and was sickly, and then just literally reinvented himself, both mind and body. You know, pretty impressive when you look at his body of work before computers and the internet. Yeah. Winston Churchill's the same way. Just a massive amount of work they put out and thoughtful, provocative things.
It's interesting. I love your answers, and I think the best leaders are the ones that always feel that they have more to go.
Yeah, it's the Socrates. A wise man knows he knows nothing.
Right, exactly. Well, John, I very much appreciate this time. The next part, just to talk about MeMD just a little bit, like describe a patient that should use MeMD. Do they need to create an account? Do they have, do you accept insurance, or how do they start to use MeMD's healthcare services if they want to?
Sure. So MeMD is pretty easy to use. It's memd.me. Go on, create a patient account for yourself. You can use it as a cash paying patient where it's deductible against your HSA or HRA. We have about 5 million subscribers right now to it. Many of them are in health plans and other large organizations that they're seeing for a discount or even for free. The whole encounter takes about 12 minutes from the time you register to the time a provider sees you and completes your treatment. But we see things range, and we're probably super conservative. I'm an attorney also by training, so I try to be very patient-centric in what telemedicine can do and what it can't do. So if you're calling up and saying, I've got the worst headache of my life, I'm having chest pain, you're going to get a quick evaluation and told you need to go to the emergency department. But for many people, you know, I always say for the woman at 3 a.m. who says, look, I know what a UTI feels like and I have one. You know, I went swimming, I did whatever it is that caused them for me. You know, you treat that person at 3 a.m. and you're like a hero because it instantly made them feel better. If they go to 24-hour Walgreens, they can feel better within the hour with, you know, some macrobid, a urinary anesthetic, and an antibiotic.
Yeah. Well, I think that if there was like a emergency migraine center that was open up from like 11 to 5 a.m., it would probably make a ton of money.
Totally. And, you know, there's so many migraine patients, and yeah, I mean, there's now some good injectable meds you can take for that hopefully reduce the frequency, but migraine care has come a long way in the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I've never had one migraine in my life, so I don't know about what I speak, but for the one I had, I'm like, wow, this really sucks, these poor people.
Yeah, no, my mother gets migraines, and they always happen at 2 a.m.
Brutal.
I know. Well, John, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I know you have to go back to treating patients, but I appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Thanks, Trish. Really a pleasure to meet you, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, you bet.